This podcast provides a platform to discuss important questions and complex issues, challenge the status quo, and confront the boundaries of the establishment. I'm retired Police Chief Daniel Hahn. I went from being arrested at 16 to serving over 34 years in law enforcement. My goal is to keep you informed with news not being reported, voices not being heard, and the untold history of how we got here so that we can create a way forward. So today on A Way Forward, we have a very special guest, Tyrone Roderick Williams, who was appointed CEO of the Fresno Housing Authority in November of 2021. He's spent the past 25 years successfully leading multi-million-dollar, large-scale revitalization initiatives totaling over $1.8 billion. Mr. Williams brings extensive experience in affordable housing, holistic and comprehensive urban revitalization efforts, community development, and much more. His background includes work in the for-profit, nonprofit, philanthropic, and government sectors, with development activities at the forefront of neighborhood transformation efforts in places like Boston, Houston, Atlanta, and Sacramento. He's on some big boards. He currently serves on a variety of boards, including, but not limited to, Affordable Housing Advisory Council for the Federal Home Loan Bank of San Francisco, the State of California CASA Board, and was appointed the California Housing Finance Agency Board by Governor Gavin Newsom. And most recently, he was appointed to the United States Consumer Financial Protection Bureau's Consumer Advisory Board, and we'll talk about those here in a little bit. Mr. Williams grew up in rural Texas, has a bachelor's degree in architecture from Prairie View A&M University, and a master's of city planning degree from Massachusetts Institute of Technology, otherwise known as MIT, and a PhD from what he calls the School of Hard Knocks. Welcome, Mr. Williams. It's a pleasure to have you on A Way Forward.
Oh, the pleasure's all mine, and I've really been looking forward to this opportunity for us to have a conversation together.
So here's my first question. A young kid from rural Texas, I think you mentioned to me before that there's more cows and things like that in your community than a lot of other things. How and why did you end up in a life, or at least a profession, in the housing world, in the the fifth largest city in California and the 33rd largest city in the United States of America, as the CEO of the redevelopment agency? What is that path that you took that made you want to spend your life's work regarding housing?
Well, first of all, I took the scenic route. So let's just start right there.
Okay.
But I grew up in a household and in a family of people who were committed to improving the lives of others. And in some cases were first the African Americans to hold certain positions. So on one side of my family, that was the conversation. On the other, I grew up, as you said, in a very rural part. So my summers were filled with feeding cows and chickens and raising produce. And so I kind of got a balance of both, seeing how people could have aspirations and really positively impact the lives of others. And I'm very down to earth, and I could, and I enjoy just being outside and being with nature. But the way that I got here was really through Prairie View A&M University. I can't say enough about historically Black colleges and the incredible opportunities that they give to many of us who go through their doors being woefully unprepared, but leave being able to take on challenges and improve the world. And that's kind of my story. So when I got to Prairie View, I wanted to be an architect. My dad was in construction. My grandfather was in construction. And so I just decided that even though I'd never met a Black architect in my life, I
Wow.
love the idea of taking things in your mind and making them become reality. So when I applied to Prairie View, to my utter shock, I got a 4-year scholarship to study architecture. And while there, I realized that architecture was a wonderful foundation, but I wanted to know how to not only design it, how to construct it, how to finance it, how to lease it, how to sell it. And they said, that's called real estate development. And although I'd never met anybody who was doing real estate development, that was the path that I chose. And so I did well at Prairie View, and because of the support that they provided. And then they said, well, if you're serious, you need to go to grad school. And after 5 years of studying architecture, I didn't want to read a book. I just wanted to go somewhere, get a job and work. And they said, well, if you're serious, you need to apply for grad school. At that time, there was only one place in the whole country that combined real estate, architecture, community planning, community development in one.
That was all in one degree?
All in one department.
Oh,
wow. To make a long story short, I applied just as a fluke. I was like, just to get these guys off my back so I could go somewhere and get a real job. I applied, and to my shock, I got accepted and offered a full scholarship. So I had to go. And 2 years later, I emerged with my degree, and that's what put me on the path. It really, my entry point to all of that was housing, affordable housing in the neighborhood. And so one of my first jobs was working in Roxbury, Massachusetts for a community development corporation, building and renovating affordable housing. And that's been one of the threads of my life and my career ever since then. And so I started in Boston. Then an opportunity.
That's a little different than Fresno, Boston.
Yes, especially from a climactic standpoint. Yeah. So after a couple of years in Boston, there was an opportunity to lead an organization back in Houston. And so I moved back to Houston with my wife and was there 10 years. Then an opportunity in Atlanta opened up to head up the largest redevelopment of public housing in the history of the city, 105 acres redevelopment, and I was hired to lead that effort. And after a number of years there, I got a call from someone said, there's an opportunity to oversee the financing for both the city and the county, and it's in Sacramento, California. And I was like, okay, I've heard of Sacramento. But I need to do some research. But
that's a very good city, that Sacramento.
Yes,
I do say so myself.
Oh, but I went to Sacramento and interviewed, and Lachelle Dozier, who is the CEO, the executive director of the Sacramento Housing and Redevelopment Agency, offered me the opportunity of a lifetime. I can't. For 7.5 years, I was part of the Sacramento Housing and Redevelopment Agency executive team. It changed my life. It prepared me for here. I've never worked for anyone who had more integrity, more insight, and allowed to be my mentor and to shine and not be afraid of having incredible people on your team and feeling intimidated. It was just incredible. So I will always, I don't care where I go, what title I have, my time working with Lachelle Dozier and the team in Sacramento will be forever a highlight of my career. And as a result of all those years of working and experiences and great things happening in Sacramento, an opportunity opened up in Fresno to be the CEO of the Fresno Housing Authority, which does many things that we did in Sacramento, except we've got a real estate development department. So we are our own developer. That's the scenic route to the corner office in Fresno, so to speak.
Well, one last thing on that topic, and I think this is for people that are, maybe don't know exactly what they're going to do. Your story sounds like so many stories I've heard that when you started out headed to Prairie View, your goal and what you saw your future was not what you are right now, right? You were looking at, sounds like trying to be an architect, and you're not an architect right now. And so I think that's so important for so many people to understand. Just like my own story, I never intended to be a police officer. And then 34 years later, I was a police, so it's important that, you were taking care of business and you wound up somewhere that obviously it sounds like you very much enjoy the work that you do, but it wasn't what you originally planned on doing.
No, that's why I said I took the scenic route.
Right, right.
Yeah.
So, you know, people aren't going to believe this, but we did not plan this. And matter of fact, I didn't even know until you told me that April is National Fair Housing Month. And the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, otherwise known as HUD, kicked off Fair Housing Month this year, commemorating 55 years since the Fair Housing Act was signed, which was signed on April 11th, 1968 by President Johnson as part of the Civil Rights Act. The act prohibited the discrimination concerning the sale, rental, financing of housing based on race, religion, national origin, and sex, handicap, and family status. As someone who has spent such a large portion of your at least professional career on the issue of housing, what does this Fair Housing Act mean to you? And let's get real. What difference has that made in our country and the lives of people in our country?
Well, it's made a huge difference. And it's a personal thing for me because I've been the victim of housing discrimination, and I know what that feels like. But the United States federal government and the U.S. courts are the greatest offenders of segregating of housing in the United States. And so for hundreds of years of our existence, there was always some segment of the population that lived in one area and in other segments of the population that lived in others.
But didn't just choose to live there.
They just didn't, particularly in the South, because of slavery and its restrictions. You had segregated housing, but that was not the norm all over the country until the federal government stepped in and started, first of all, really after World War II, building public housing for returning vets. But when they built this housing, because there was a real need, much like we have now, there was a housing crisis from all these vets coming back, starting families, needing housing. And one of the first elements of the federal government's attempt to address the problem was building what became known as public housing. But when they started building this housing, the government segregated it. The government said these developments on this side of town are for white only, and then these developments on the other side of town are for Black or people of color. And that really was the impetus for even more laws and programs that intentionally segregated people from living wherever they wanted to live, as long as they could afford to live there. So even with the veterans who were returning, the GI Bill supported white veterans being able, maybe they moved into white public housing first, but after they got on their feet, got jobs, they were able to get mortgages and move out into the suburbs. Black veterans were denied that. On many cases, they if they got a mortgage, it wasn't going to be to move into one of those nicer subdivisions. It was going to be to buy a house in a segregated neighborhood, and that limited their options. And so over time, what we see is that more and more of the white families who originally moved into public housing got on their feet and had options and federal assistance to buy homes wherever they chose. And so whites started moving out, and public housing started having higher vacancy rates. And just to be able to make the numbers crunch, they started moving Black people into those communities that had been formerly all white. And then that's when white flight even increased even more. And so over a period of about 30 years, you see whites moving out of public housing, more Blacks moving in, and then the federal government stopped funding the public housing to properly maintain it. And so now these Black families are trapped into public housing. They don't have the same options and opportunities as their white counterparts, even though they may be making the same amount of money and qualify. But then the federal government stopped financing and providing support for the maintenance of public housing, and it started to deteriorate and become just pockets of poverty all over the country. That was intentional. That wasn't accidental.
So are you trying to say that the disparities, whether it's wealth, housing, whatever, between the communities that we often still see today was funded and enabled by government? Is that what you're trying to tell me?
Absolutely. Absolutely. There's no question about it.
Well, what's interesting is on that same note, even here in Sacramento, so our communities were segregated also, redlined, and the redlined area here in Sacramento between the late 30s to the late 40s, the housing market in the redlined area downtown, the West End, went down 30%, while other housing that those minority families that you spoke about couldn't live in, those communities, the housing in those communities went up 46%. So one set of people is gaining wealth and the other is not, which brings me to my next question. So every day, whether it's friends or just people I run into or talk to who live or spend a significant amount of time in communities around our state, but specifically here in Sacramento, that have high poverty. Matter of fact, I grew up in a community in Oak Park here in Sacramento that was high poverty. And oftentimes these high poverty communities tend to also have high crime, low performing schools, and lost opportunities. But many of the times when I talk to people about these communities, a lot of people's opinion is the fault of that, or where you lay the blame for the things that go on in these impoverished communities, is at the feet of the people who live there. And they put it on those people. Those people just need to get jobs. Those people need to have the father in the home. Those people are just violent by nature. And that's why those communities are like that. So I want to ask you, do you feel that's the case? And a second question, do you think housing, and I think you kind of touched on it a little bit in the last thing you said, but do you think housing plays a big role in that also? And that is something that the folks that say these things are missing?
Well, I do believe that the conditions, let's just say that, many of the conditions that we currently see in neighborhoods that we would call impoverished or at one point or were impoverished are the direct result of federal, state, and local policies and programs that restricted housing, that restricted access to capital, that restricted movement out of these areas into other areas. And so, first and foremost, yes, I believe that these are intentional situations. I do believe that there is no substitute for personal initiative.
Right.
We acknowledge that the fabric of the family plays a major role in many cases, but at the heart of it all, we've seen time and time again where people who had initiative, people who come from strong family and community structures, run into these bureaucratic barriers that are designed to lock out opportunity or restrict opportunity. And those have long-term ripple benefits that go on for decades if they are not properly addressed. And I believe that we haven't properly addressed them. I mean, you talk about growing up at Oak Park, it's part of, it's a victim of urban renewal.
Absolutely.
So, you see a thriving neighborhood and the federal government says, hey, let's run a freeway through it.
Right. Right.
You see.
You're not even from Sac and you know the history. Look at you.
So you see schools where teachers are actively engaged and part of the community and a part of the economic fabric. But then when desegregation comes into schools, great teachers are moved out of the community, and new teachers move into the community who have no real connection, no cultural sensitivity, and you begin to see the education systems begin to be undermined. So every system that is impacting communities, you can trace segregation and racist policies that led to the demise and negative impact of those populations in those areas across the country. It's pervasive and it was intentional.
So, I retired as police chief a little over a year ago. And, when you've worked in a profession for 34 years, you have a tendency to build up your vacation time and all these other banks. And so when you retire, most places cash you out a percentage of all those banks, which is a nice check on one hand. But I have to tell you, the tax man came at not too many months ago, and I was rather shocked at the tax bill that my wife and I owed. And it makes you think about how many taxes we're paying. And, I'd never had a bill like that before.
Well, you never retired before either. So.
That's true. That's true. So, what is your response to people that say, yeah, okay, back in the day, in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, that freeway you talk about that separated Oak Park from Curtis Park, that was built in the early 60s. We're in 2023 now. And the city is not redlined anymore. And so why should I be paying my taxes that I worked a long time, really hard, work every day, regardless of what profession I might be in, to support my family? And somebody like Tyrone Roderick Williams comes along as a CEO of a redevelopment agency, and he's advocating to use some of my hard-earned money to help people get into housing, to help affordable housing, to help redevelopment and all these things. It's 2023. Why can't these people that are utilizing these services, how come they can't do what I did? Just work hard and earn your own money and buy your own house. All that stuff was a long time ago. What do you say to that? Because I hear that a lot.
Well, I do too. I hear it quite often. And let me just say this. I understand, I don't agree, but I understand that perspective because it lacks historical context.
So they don't know the history that you're talking about, is what you're saying.
That's right. So they're only looking at the reality that they experience, because many times people who embrace that kind of thinking don't really understand the realities of others in 2023. And so when you come from a family where home ownership has always been a part of what your reality, okay, so you understand many things about the home ownership benefits that people who have never owned a home are really clueless about. And so, number one, our goal is that anyone should be able to access housing wherever they choose. But the reality is, because of the historical practices, many people don't have the resources that others do to move into housing
Because of the history.
because of the history,
Okay.
because of the lack of the ability to earn earn and save, or because of the lack of the ability to use your house as equity to pull that money out and give that to your kids to go to college or do whatever it is you choose.
Which many people did.
Oh,
right?
or start a business. I mean, that was like money in the bank for so many people, because this is a reality. When Blacks were not allowed, particularly after World War II, to move into those other neighborhoods, these suburbs and other communities that were being developed and financed by the federal government, those families who bought those houses then, those homes across the country have escalated in value. So the house that somebody bought in the 40s now could be 4 to 5, even 6 times more than what they paid for it. So there is the benefit.
Especially in California.
Yes, especially, but if your family was denied the opportunity to buy a house that has had the benefit of these escalations, you're so far behind the 8 ball that you could not just instantly catch up with that kind of financial benefit. So using resources to help people. I know reparations is like, a horrible word. People go into convulsions when you say reparations. But there must be an adjustment in recognition of what was denied, so that those who choose to move forward, we talk about a way forward, have the opportunity to have the hand up to be able to do that. And I know a lot of people have a whole lot of problems with that, because, anytime you start trying to help somebody, they raise their hand and say, me too, without the context.
It's interesting you say that, because when you say a hand up, what you just described is people back in the day, like especially after World War II, certain people did get a hand up, and certain people did not get a hand up. So when we're talking about, why should we give somebody a hand up today? Well, certain groups of people did get a hand up. It's not like they didn't get a hand up back then. And one of the things, as I was doing my history research years ago for the courses I teach, it was kind of eye-opening for me, and it's something I had never heard of before, as these historians talk about that the GI Bill after World War II is what really created the middle class in our country. And if certain groups of people, certain groups of GIs were essentially locked out of the GI Bill, to me, in my math, classes, equations, that means those groups were locked out of the middle class. And so if the middle class is really the bedrock of our country, there's certain groups that were locked out of those opportunities, which is, I think, is what you're saying. So I wanted to get to some of the things I mentioned in your introduction. You're part of some pretty high level boards, and I know before talking to you, I had no idea what these boards do. So I imagine some of the listeners.
Before we go down that path, let me just tell you, I am, sometimes I go home and my wife and I are talking, and I just say, can you believe where we are and the opportunity that we have to help people move forward? It's astonishing to me, and it's on my own life story. I have lived these, through all of these opportunities, but I'm even more committed to helping people understand what the opportunities are, and being an unashamed advocate to helping people connect to resources, because that's the game changer. One of the things that we suffer from is lack of knowledge. If you don't even know a program exists, there's no way you can even tap into it. So these boards that I'm on, I'm not on those boards because I need to improve my resume. I'm on those boards because I want to take every resource, every opportunity, and bring it back to people who have no idea, and then encourage them to take advantage of it.
Absolutely.
And that's what I'm about.
And we're going to get into that, but you made me think of something else before we get into what the boards do and how they help or are intended to help. You know, I don't think there's anybody in our country that has not been impacted in some way or another what has happened in just the last couple of years, whether it's social justice protest or unrest in pretty much every major city across our country, where protesters are talking about equity and justice and impoverished communities and access, that all typically ends up getting sparked off by some police incident. But when you listen to the protesters, they're talking about law enforcement, but also things bigger than law enforcement. So my question to you is, what role do you think housing plays in moving our country forward that potentially can ease some of these protests and the concerns of the people that are out in the middle of the street protesting and demanding things of our society, of our government? What role do you think housing plays in some of the issues that we have seen on every news program over the last couple years, like every day?
I think housing is fundamental, because without stable housing, you can't have a stable life. And right now, not only in California, but across the country in many areas, we're experiencing a housing crisis where the cost of housing, whether it's for sale housing or rental housing, far exceeds what the average person is able to pay. The increases in rents and in property values has far exceeded the wage increase. So people are feeling many different tensions in their lives now. Many folks who've not had housing insecurity issues in the past are now facing that reality. There's also a shortage of housing in many areas. So even if you can afford it, it doesn't exist, because after the Great Recession across the country, housing came to a halt because there was, for a large period of time, an abundance of housing, but all of that has been either purchased or is occupied, and now there is a need for solid, affordable housing. So once you have solid, affordable housing, then you can focus on a job or education or healthcare. But when you don't know where you're going to lay your head or how long you're going to have a place to lay your head, that adds to the tension of anybody's life. And that's a reality in which we face today across the country.
Yeah, I just think oftentimes we get a little bit too narrow with our solutions. And we, you know, as a police chief, I used to always try to think, well, we have, you know, officers that part of our role was to hold people accountable, but the solution has to be much larger than that if we're going to change people's lives and don't keep, you know, these things that happen in these communities going. And so you are on the appointed by the governor, I might add, the California the California Housing Finance Agency Board. Tell us, what does that board do?
That board really focuses on two major aspects of housing finance. One aspect is the multifamily aspect, building what we call affordable apartment complexes. Okay. And that's part of what my agency does. That's our real estate development department. We build multifamily mixed income housing throughout Fresno County. The other side of the opportunity is really among the home buyers.
People that are trying to get their like first home and care for their family kind of folks.
So the goal is really to have mortgage assistance programs that really help people get into that first home, down payment and closing cost assistance programs that help people overcome the huge down payments that are often required to get into a home. And so both these two sides, the multifamily and the single family housing, really fund and finance a huge amount of the housing that gets built throughout the state of California. And to sit on that on that board and to really be active and engaged in policies that are intended to remove or reduce barriers that we know exist to moving into home ownership, to look at thinking out of the box in new and creative ways of providing down payment and closing cost assistance. It's a real opportunity for me to have a voice and opening up doors of opportunity across this city, our city here, and across the state. And it's making an impact.
Let me ask you this, just to make sure I'm right. So you talked about assistance with people getting into a home, or often probably their first home. Mm-hmm. The concept anyway of assisting people to getting into housing, as you spoke about earlier, this is not a new concept, right? The GI Bill did similar things, but only for certain groups of people, right? So this assisting people isn't like this new Mr. Williams idea that I'm gonna help these certain people. It's not a new concept of helping people getting into housing.
It's an essential element to getting into housing across this country, and it's always been that way. This is nothing new. This is not a social experiment. This is the way it's been done since the federal government started building housing and helping people get into it. It's just not been often available to us. And the good thing is that I'm happy to report at the California Housing Finance Agency, equity and inclusion is at the heart of every program that we look at, every policy. We understand that there have been barriers, and we understand that we have an opportunity to provide opportunities to those who've not had it in the past. And we're not ashamed about it. We're not ashamed of it.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's not a new philosophy or a new kind of program. It's just the issue isn't that there's being assistance provided. The historical issue is that assistance wasn't afforded to all people.
Yes.
So,
I just found it's always interesting, and when the group who feels they are in power gets assistance, nobody says anything. People get on the bandwagon, and
we even have different names for it, right? For some people, it's called welfare, and for some people, it's just, hey, it's the right thing to do.
It's the right thing to do for our country,
Yeah.
But then when others who've been locked out, blocked out, finally have an opportunity to have a seat at the table, now we've got all kinds of negative titles associated with that opportunity. It's quite interesting, to say the least.
I want to talk to you about one more board you're on, and have an understanding of what that organization does. You were appointed to the United States Consumer Financial Protection Bureau's Consumer Advisory Board. So what does that board do, and how does that help our communities across the country?
Well, it is directly tied to housing, because the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is a government agency that makes sure that consumers are treated fairly by banks and other financial institutions, and it helps consumers when they feel as though they are being restricted or discriminated against. That's where you can file a complaint. And so we know that banks and lending institutions historically in the past, and sometimes even now, have been co-conspirators in coming up with strategies and schemes with fees and requirements that really limit consumers' ability to be successful. And so what we have an opportunity to do is to talk about, information on credit reports, debt collection, mortgages, student loans, anything related to a financial service. This bureau oversees, and when there is a concern by a consumer, you can go on the website, file a complaint, and they follow up. Oftentimes we feel as though maybe, things aren't being done for us equitably, but we don't know who to tell, or we don't know where to go. Well, one place to go where they will follow up is the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau.
So if I feel like something wasn't right about something regarding housing or something I'm trying to attain, I have an avenue that I could have somebody that looks into that and sees if in fact my gut, my feelings are correct.
Not only housing, from a mortgage, because these are all financial
right.
institutions, but if your car loan, your student loan, your credit card, and your mortgage, if you've got any concerns about, illegal late fees or penalties, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is a place to file that complaint.
Good. So I want to close with two more questions. And you have got to be one of the most upbeat, positive people I have ever met. And I've known you for a few years back from when you were, in that city, the capital of California city, that Sacramento city. Tell us, I assume you're hopeful for a positive future for our country, for our neighborhoods, for Fresno and cities across our country. I think there's a lot of people that aren't as positive right now over the last couple of years, and actually for decades, I'm sure, but especially over the last couple of years with a lot of the struggles from COVID to social justice movements to all sorts of things that we've been dealing with. Rise in housing prices, rise in all prices, gas, everything, right? It's been pretty tough over the last couple of years. So tell us what brings you hope and why you remain so positive for a future that means tomorrow is going to be better than today.
Well, first of all, this is not the first time we've gone through hardships. I often think about our ancestors and the hardships that they lived and thrived through. So yes, we have gone through a cycle of hardship, and there'll be other cycles. But what gives me the optimistic point of view, one, that I'm called to this time in history, that I could have been sent into the earth at any point. But I believe in divine purpose. And my divine purpose is to help open up doors of opportunity. So I view even these hardships with an optimism. And I'm just going to tell you, you ask about me, I know other people will have different opinions, but I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And greater is he who's in me than he that's in the world. So if anybody comes against me, I'm going to be positive because I believe and I know that I have God, not only in me, but on my side. That helps me overcome challenges because when I run into roadblocks, when I run into discrimination, when I run into unexpected bills that may be tax bills or gas at the pump, I know who my source is. My source is not limited because I have an eternal source. So my optimism is not limited to what I can do or what other people do, but who is leading and calling me forward. So that's why I'm optimistic, man. I know I win in the end, and I encourage others to not get locked into narrow thinking that says, I can only do so much, or this person won't let me do this, or yes, there are all kinds of issues, but show up. Let your voice be heard. Don't put your head in, stick your head in the sand and go, woe is me. No, empowered is me. Every challenge that we have, I'm empowered to take it on, whether by myself or with a group, and I don't give up. and I don't cave in and I don't quit, even though I have numerous opportunities to cave in and quit and get discouraged. That's the optimism, and that's what empowers me to move forward. And I would encourage others to dig deep. Those people who overcame challenges, many of them had strong spiritual foundations that allowed the supernatural to overcome what they saw in the natural and to think forward. That's how I operate.
Man, I start feeling like I was in church there for a second.
Well, look, you asked the question, brother.
I did.
So I gave you the answer for Tyrone Roderick Williams.
I appreciate
it. Disagree, but that's what motivates and drives me forward.
Absolutely. So I want to close on this. For people that might have been inspired by some of the things you've said today and some of the things that, you know, the historical perspective and some of the challenges that history still is created in today's time and for families today that might be struggling. How can people help? How can people get more information? How can people assist? Where could they go for these things? Talk to us a little bit about how, if somebody wants to help in these things like housing and other things you've talked about today, what can they do? Well,
first, from anybody who wants to connect with me, LinkedIn is my source. So I welcome people connecting to me with LinkedIn, and that'll be also shared in your post. But those other two organizations that I shared, the California Housing Finance Agency, if you are a supporter of people being able to access home ownership opportunities, go to their website. There's a whole list of resources. I'm all about pointing people to resources, and then they can connect to that and then determine what best suits their particular needs. So the California Housing Finance is the way to go for home ownership at the state level. But there's also the Federal Home Loan Bank of San Francisco. They have a down payment and closing cost assistance. That's $29,000 for qualified buyers.
Wow.
So if
that's
you're
a little bit.
And I had the opportunity to vote on that. We raised it from 22,000 to 29,000. That's why having a seat at the table is so important. But that information could be available for you, and share that, whether you're a realtor or whether you know someone who's interested in purchasing a home. Share these resources with them and encourage them to check into that. Also, with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, there's an opportunity to go to the website, consumerfinance.gov. You can go on there. You can see all of the financial resources that they have. And if need be, you can file a complaint there as well. And so those are some resources that I would encourage everyone to go and visit if they're interested.
Outstanding. Well, Mr. Williams, it has been a pleasure, and I appreciate you coming on A Way Forward and talking about the history and how we got here, because I think a lot of people, including myself back in the day, put history in history, right? Like, that was a long time ago. That's not today, but history impacts today and where we're at today, including the community I grew up in, the neighborhood I grew up in. The way it was when I grew up there was all because of history. And growing up, I never knew that neighborhood wasn't always that way. I always assumed it was that way. And it wasn't until I was an adult that I realized that my community that I was born and raised in wasn't always that way. And even with that said, I loved growing up in my community. It was amazing. The people there were amazing. So I so much appreciate your time, your knowledge, your expertise, and your willingness to share that with so many people. So thank you for coming on.
Well, I appreciate it. And as the CEO of Fresno Housing, every day we support over 50,000 people, from farm workers to veterans. It is amazing. So opening up doors of equal opportunity for housing is what I and the whole Fresno Housing team does on an hourly basis. and it is a privilege and a joy. So yes, we do celebrate the 55th anniversary of the signing of the Fair Housing Act because we're continuing a legacy that opens doors of opportunity for anyone and everyone, and it's a privilege to do so.
Well, again, thank you and happy National Fair Housing Month to you. It was that's something I didn't know, so you helped me understand that. So thank you again, and I appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
One of the big purposes of A Way Forward is to hear different voices and different opinions, because that is how we can make informed decisions ourselves. So if you are someone that would like to come on A Way Forward to express your opinion, go to chiefhahn.com/podcast. Chief, HAHN.com/podcast.